And I've started filming a couple of minutes early just to give people a chance to come in and join us for today's story session for Scary Fairies, The Dark Side of the Fae, kindly organised by the wonderful Holly at the Centre for Folklore, Myth and Magic. We would have been there this weekend sharing stories and a rather magical recipe I've got. But we're all in lockdown, so I'm sharing this from home instead. Hopefully, a few of you are starting to join me now. If you want to give us a wave and let me know you're there, that would be fantastic. Oh, hi, Sharon. Finally caught up with me live. So, yeah, I am sharing stories from near my part of Scotland and some from a little further afield, but all about some very mischievous fairies and this wonderful recipe that I've started to tell you about. It's why you've got a view today of my desk. I've got all sorts of ingredients here, and while we're waiting for a few more people to join us, I'll start showing you what we've got. If you want to get hold of these sort of items at home, then you can make the potion along with me. And if you don't have them, then I will be sharing the video later on, probably on YouTube, with a private link. So if you want to then gather the ingredients, and you'll hear how careful you've got to be and where you need to find them as we delve into this selection of stories. You can go and it'll give you time to go and source all the things you need, bring them back and make your own. And if you like, I've got some tiny bottles I would have been taking along for the workshop this week. And if you fancy just having some of the potion as I make it, when you find out what it's all about and some of the risks entailed in using this particular ointment, then you can message me your details and I will post some out to you. So I need to probably start by telling you on about some of the adventures I've been on in the last 18 months, 2 years, trying to track down exactly the right ingredients for our fairy ointment. One such adventure took me down to the Scottish borders. We travel through the Eildon Hills every year on our way to Northumberland, and we pass through Eilston, the place that's famous for one particular former inhabitant. A certain Thomas Rhymer is said to have lived there. Now, True Thomas, as he became known in later life, had a most beautiful voice. His singing could bewitch anyone. And what he loved to do was walk in these gorgeous undulating green hills near his home. And there he would lie down under the shade of the hawthorn tree, the May tree. Now, it's probably would have been better if he'd not chosen this particular tree, because what you'll know if you've listened to my storytelling before is that a hawthorn tree is a signifier that this may be a hill that the fairies live in. An oak, an ash and a thorn, the saying goes, are the trees that will grow on a fairy hill. And hawthorns, as I'm sure some of you are aware, have even had such significance as fairy trees that whole roads have been turned and twisted to avoid them in Ireland, because they really are quite magical trees. It's best not to sleep under one. But our Thomas, well, he lay under the shade of the hawthorn tree and he sang his sweet songs. Little did he know that he was watched day in, day out by a certain woman, queen of fairyland. She took to riding on a horse past where Thomas lay singing. And the more she saw and the more she heard, the more she fell in love with this tuneful young man. Eventually, the day came when the fairy queen decided she would take him with her back to her domain, deep in the Eildon Hills. She led Thomas away from under the tree and invited him to join her on her horse. She was so beautiful. Her looks and her voice enchanted him. He fell deep under her spell, and at the queen's bidding, he got up on the back of her horse, and she rode away over the hills. She advised Thomas not to eat or speak a word in the place that she led him to. She told him not to say a single word, and she would reward him well. Thomas did as he was told, and after what seemed like a short but pleasant ride, he alighted from the horse and played a tune or two for this magical queen. As soon as his songs were done, she led him back to the horse, told him to alight once more, and took him back to where he'd come from. The young man was astonished to find that 7 years had passed. The beautiful fairy handed him an apple and told him now he could eat the food from her kingdom. As he bit into the juicy, sweet, succulent fruit, he suddenly felt his mind alight like a shooting star bursting through his brain. Now, some people say what happened as that sparkle, that burst, that magical fire happened, he found himself compelled to tell the truth, and he was given the name True Thomas. Other stories tell that he found the gift of prophecy and he could foresee the future, and his stories became known across Scotland, from Aberdeen to the borders. I don't know which of those is true, but I do know that some of the stories he wove were quite magical and stay with us till this very day. Now, I've led you up to the Eildon tree, as that hawthorn is now known, up on the Eildon Hills in the Scottish borders, to find one particular ingredient for our potion that I'm going to make for you today. Whilst I was up in the Eildon Hills, I found some wild thyme growing. This has been dried out now, but that's fine. Dried wild thyme is perfect. Smells so fragrant, and we often use it for coughs and colds in herbal medicine today. It's great for soothing a sore throat and helping respiratory infections. So we have our wild thyme. Now, if you need to go and gather your own wild thyme, you need to get it from a fairy hill for this particular recipe. Now, the easiest way to find a fairy hill, because people have said, how do you find a fairy hill? And I have said, you know, the oak, the ash and the thorn is good guidance. The other one to note is the shape. You know, the disbelievers will say that this is because they're, you know, Iron Age burial sites or Pictish areas of tombs and earthworks. But we all know that if you give it a little bit of careful thought and you look and watch carefully, you can spot that some of these are in fact fairy hills. But the other way, as a storyteller, that I suggest you find a fairy hill is you find yourself a really good story about someone being stolen away by the fae, because that will tell you for certain that at one time this has been a fairy hill. The Eildon Hill was my one for the time. I had to find a slightly different fairy hill for my next ingredient. There were no hazel buds growing when I visited the Eildons, but fortunately for me, just a short distance along the road from me is another particularly famous fairy hill. It's called Doon Hill, and it's near a village called Aberfoyle, and it was the home to a certain Reverend Robert Kirk, who in 1691 wrote a book called The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns and Fairies. He knew so much about the fairies that it said they couldn't let him stay amongst mortals any longer, and he in turn was stolen away by the fairies and kept. He did try to escape, but unfortunately he would have had to have his cousin throw a dirk at his apparition. When he saw him in the church, he should have thrown a knife towards him, and his cousin thought that this was far too dangerous and decided not to do it. And the Reverend Robert Kirk disappeared back into the hill. And there he's said to be the chaplain to the fairy queen. Now, what there is on Doon Hill in Aberfoyle are hazel trees. It's a beautiful wood. There is a pine tree at the top that marks where the Reverend Robert Kirk is said to be in his subterranean underground kingdom with the fairies. But on either side of the pine are oak and hazel bushes, because our recipe needs fresh hazel buds. I've got them in my pestle and mortar here. And what you do is you grind them up. They need to be fresh, and they really smell green and lovely. And whilst I was there, I had a look around, trying to find another thing I need for my ingredients. It's I'm just double checking my recipe. I want to give you the exact wording because this is quite an old recipe. I'll tell you about that in a little minute. It needs grass of a fairy throne. Now, how do you find a fairy throne, I hear you ask? You need to find a fairy hill. And then on that hill, if you're lucky, often surrounded by a ring of mushrooms, of toadstools, you will find a seat-like shape where the long grasses surround the back, reaching up to the sky. I haven't travelled quite so far for the grass. You see, there's a fairy hill just near the bottom of my garden. And so I've been out this morning, because it's just a few minutes walk away, to get some grass from where there's an amazing seat-shaped patch. And it's surrounded this morning, there weren't any yesterday, but this morning when I went out, it was totally surrounded by a fairy ring of toadstools. And so it felt just right, and that my hunch was correct, that this indeed was a fairy throne. So I felt quite safe collecting a couple of blades of grass. I left the fairy queen a little saucer of milk, as is the old way, and a piece of cake, just as a thank you for lending me a couple of blades of grass from her throne. So we've got our fresh hazel buds and our grass from the fairy throne, and we're starting to make them to a really fresh green paste. Now, my next ingredient. Well, I maybe start a little further back. I'm going to tell you a very short story about this recipe. I'd heard about it. I'd read little bits in books about this, and I'd read bits on the internet, but I'd never actually got all the detail of the recipe because people were shadowy and guarded about how much they revealed. Eventually, I discovered that this recipe was held in the archive at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And then, as if a little bit of magic had sprinkled across my world, I got a phone call from a lovely woman, Susan, at the Ashmolean, to ask if I would go down to Oxford and deliver a workshop. My look at Scottish folk magic and plant traditions are kissed in time. My project had been looking at all kinds of stories from across my area of Scotland about how we used plants. And the Ashmolean had a wonderful exhibition on called Spellbound, looking all kinds of magic through the ages. I gathered up my box full of herbal remedies, some of the stories and the artwork children had done during the school visits for the Kissed in Time project, and off I went to Oxford. After I'd delivered the workshop and shared the stories of tatty bogles and magical turnips. I know, magical turnips, who knew? I asked Susan about the recipe held in the archives. She didn't know anything about it. She'd never heard of it. And just as I was preparing to leave, down a staircase and out towards the back door, an elderly gentleman tapped me on the shoulder. He had an ancient face and a uniform that looked like it had come from another age. He helped me carry my stuff to the car and then led me back inside the museum. We got in the lift. He pressed a combination of buttons and it dropped down further than it had done before. When we got out, we were in a subterranean underground cellar. Arches marked where the road ran overhead, and we walked maybe 500 yards along this gloomy tunnel bedecked with cobwebs. There he took a big brass key from his pocket and, unlocking a door, opened up a room, and in the room was a trunk. Inside the trunk was one piece of paper, old and dusty. He unrolled it and read me the recipe, written in the handwriting of the early 17th century. This recipe is dated from 1600, and it's said to be one of the most successful recipes, an ointment to enable one to see the fairies. So, then and there, I popped out a pen and a pencil and quickly made notes. I got permission, of course, from the elderly gentleman who, as I'm sure you have guessed, vanished once we returned to the main body of the museum. I went in and checked with the rest of the staff, and they laughed and said they still weren't aware of this recipe, but if I had made notes, then I was very welcome to use it. I've been sharing it with usually just groups of children, because this is quite a strong recipe, and it needs to be used by people who are aware of the risks. It also needs to be used by people who are able to still see the magic. So, on with the recipe. Now you've found out where I got it from and you've found out about a couple of the ingredients, I'm going to tell you what we do. Now, there are volumes in this recipe, but I'm going to make a slightly smaller amount because I don't want 2 pints of it. It suggests that you take a pint of salad oil in which has been infused the petals of marigold, and you pour it into a vial, into a glass. So we have a little marigold oil infused with calendula, and it's going into my glass. So we have that. Next, you need rose water. So a little rose water is going to go in with the oil. So, I usually use about an even amount. I've tried this several times, as I've said, and An even amount tends to work quite well. Now, the recipe does describe this as an ointment. However, what I would say is don't expect a gloopy, gooey ointment like you might buy in a chemist's or in over a counter in a beauty department. This is more of an emulsion. For those of you who know what an emulsion is, it's oil and water mixed together. There are a few ingredients, so it's a little bit like salad dressing. Salad dressing for your face. So we mix it up, and the recipe says you need to wash the oil with the water. That basically means shake it up, or until it becomes white. So you can see it's starting to go white. Oh, and I wish we had smell-o-vision. It smells absolutely gorgeous. And I always say, people go, I spilt it on me when you're working with small children. And I'm like, that's okay. It's really, really good for your skin. What can I say? It helps you see fairies and is good for your skin. So we mixed up our marigold infused oil and our rose water. So the thing with the marigolds and the roses is the recipe says they need to be collected in the East. That in itself takes some doing, and I have found that it's quite effective because if you collect them from somewhere else, because everywhere is east of somewhere, and flowers have a tendency to follow the sun. So at some point, they will have been facing east. So anyway, that's safe and done. We've washed it until the oil becomes white, and then you put in a mixture of hollyhock buds. She says, where have I put my hollyhock? In there. And I like to mix my hollyhock buds. These are hollyhock buds, white hollyhock that we had growing in the garden in our last house, and they've dried out, and they go in to the pestle and mortar. If you're just joining me now, then you'll know that you won't have seen me start off with the grass and the hazel buds. So there is a little mixture going on in here, and we're breaking that down with the pestle and mortar. The buds of hollyhock and the flowers of marigolds. So we've got a few more marigolds going in here. Marigolds are fantastic. They have I don't know whether the fairies like them because of their antifungal properties, but they are really good. And like a marigold foot bath will help feet problems, and just marigold tea can be really soothing. So marigold's another lovely ingredient. It's great for the skin. It's been used for things to benefit the complexion for hundreds of years, and so it's another lovely ingredient. Someone was really clever about thinking out this recipe. It really does do wonders for the skin. So now you can see we're starting to break that down into a paste. Usually in a workshop, what I do is I get all the lovely people participating in the workshop. Children love it. To help me do the pestle and mortar bit, whilst I share a few fairy stories. But I'll top and tail all this with a story. I'm just following my recipe. I like to do it in the right order. After that, we have the flowers or tops of wild thyme. So you remember our wild thyme came from the Eildon Hills, where Thomas the Rhymer was stolen away by the fairy queen and given the gift of prophecy, of telling the truth. So our thyme has gone in there with our marigold, hollyhocks, and our hazel buds from Doon Hill in Aberfoyle, where the Reverend Robert Kirk was stolen away by the fairies, and the grass gathered from a fairy throne, which I think I'm pretty sure I've identified correctly, just at the bottom of my garden. So all in all, I better actually be careful. What did I say the Reverend Robert Kirk was stolen away for? Knowing too much about the fairies. Right, so now we have that. We put all of this into the oil in the glass. And there it stays for 3 days. It sits out in the sun and dissolves. And then when you've done that, well, the ingredients will have all infused into the oil and the rose water. Let's put the lid back on. And what you get is an incredibly fragrant it does look like salad dressing. A really beautiful fragrant oil. So we're going to pop that over in a sunny window for 3 days, and then, as I said, if anyone wants some, I'll decant it into little jars and let me have your address and I'll post them out to you. Probably better rub that in. Now what you do with this ointment is take a little bit on the tip of your finger and you just rub it into the place, just in the centre of your forehead, just above and between your eyebrows, and you rub it in, and it gives you the gift of being able to see the fae folk, the she as we call them in Scotland. But be careful what you wish for, because, well, there's another story I better leave you with today that warns about fairy ointments and lotions to help you see the she. It said that a woman not so far from here, who was skilled at helping people give birth, was woken one day by a sharp knock on the door. When she opened it, a strange, pale man stood outside, and he beckoned her away with him. Off they went to a house she'd never seen before on the very edge of the village, a well-kept cottage. She thought for a minute and pondered why she'd not seen this house as she'd passed up and down the streets on her daily chores and errands. But when the man explained that inside his wife was giving birth and she desperately needed help, the woman forgot about not having seen the cottage before and rushed to the young woman's assistance. Now, the young woman struggled but finally gave birth to a healthy baby. And then the midwife was told something really rather extraordinary. She was told by the couple that they needed to go away, even though the child was still very young. She was told that they would pay her well if she took care of the baby. They had a beautiful carved cradle for the infant, and the woman was made comfy on a seat beside the cradle. She was given enough food to eat and a comfy blanket to keep her warm on the cold nights. She was told to rock the child and given a bottle with some green sweet-scented liquid inside. She was reminded that every day she needed to take a little of the oil and apply it to the baby's face. She was made to promise that under no circumstances at all would she ever put any of this ointment on her own face. Well, the woman thought this was odd, to say the least, but she'd had a lifetime of caring for women giving birth and for looking after newborn infants, and so she just took it as the strange advice of worried new parents and bade them farewell as they made their way off towards the distant hills. Day in, day out, the woman looked after the lovely child. She loved putting the ointment onto its face because it gurgled and sang and was so happy when she'd done so. She would rock the baby in the cradle with the blanket over her knee, singing it lullabies and looking after the child so well that it really thrived. But one day, as she was applying the ointment to the child's face, a bee buzzed in through the window and hovered around her nose, its full pollen sacs making her eyes water and her nose run, and she went to sneeze and she put her hand up to her face and phew! As she moved her hand away from her face, a different world was revealed. She was no longer in a beautiful, well-kept cottage, but in a cave. And the child was a strange, laughing creature, laughing at, well, beings all around it that the woman had never seen before. Magical, ethereal beings, clad in red and green. They danced and sang, and the baby laughed in amusement. It said when the woman got up to try and leave the cave, the fairies blocked her way. When they moved to let her through, she found that she was not in a street at the end of her village, but deep in a subterranean world, and although she wandered and looked, she couldn't find a way out. The fairies looked after her very well for the rest of her days, and not having any family to miss, she quite liked the life that she found herself in. But what I would say as a footnote to that story is, if you do decide to make yourself my fairy ointment, my recipe from 1600 to help you see fairies, or you do ask me to send you a little bottle, then be very careful what you look for. Lots of people have used it and said that they have seen fairies. Most of them have taken the warnings I've spread throughout my stories. Don't speak. If you see fairies, don't talk to them. Don't know too much. Don't tell anyone else what you've seen. Maybe just one or two people you trust. Me and your parents, brothers and sisters and grannies, grandpas are usually okay. And don't eat their food unless they offer you an apple in payment for a beautifully sung song. Thank you all very much for joining me today, and do hop over to Twitter, for those of you who do, and join in with the rest of the amazing folklore and stories and research that is being shared with the hashtag Scary Fairies for Dark Side of the Fae, our lost weekend. I think our weekend got stolen away by the Fae. What do you think, Holly? And I'll see you all again for a story soon. If you want to tap into my project, A Kissed in Time, do find the group on my Facebook page, and I share there's a few stories on there that are suitable for all ages, and there are lots of little games and traditional uses for plants. And I look forward to hearing more from you as well. If you've got a recipe or a plant game you'd like to share, do come over onto the group and share it. And I'll see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of Scary Fairies. Thank you very much. Goodbye.